for the summertime blues.
The 80s. This is the decade that many consider to be the golden age of horror. This is in no small part down to the birth of home video. No longer did children have to sneak into the theatre because they didn't look old enough to fool the people working at the box office. No, instead they merely had to convince their parents that it was a good idea for them to sit through such classics as Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street and Child's Play. Either that, or they were just blessed with the gift of irresponsible parents who didn't quite seem to care what they watched, just as long as they were out of the way. It was during this culture of video nasties, slasher horrors and Stephen King adaptations that we saw a rise in what can only be described as the little monsters subgenre of horror. Anything from space aliens, demons, killer dolls, goblins, or indeed gremlins. No matter what their origin, these tiny terrors would often be the menace of suburban families everywhere, usually targeting young children and their mothers in their homes. Whether this was an intentional social commentary, attacking a particular way of living, or merely a deep-rooted bias of representation by those who make movies, is open to debate. But either way, if you belong to white middle-class America, there was a strong chance these little monsters were coming for you. The film that kicked off this subgenre is undoubtedly the 1984 film Gremlins, produced by Steven Spielberg and directed by Joe Dante. But while this film ignited a trend, it can hardly claim sole responsibility for being the first to feature little monsters terrorising suburbia. You only need to go back 10 years to 1973 made-for-TV movie Don't Be Afraid of the Dark to see an earlier template for this kind of film. And even Spielberg himself produced Twilight Zone the movie, released just 1 year prior to Gremlins, which featured the story Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, about a man on a passenger jet who sees a gremlin on the wing. This segment of the film is itself a remake of an earlier episode from the Twilight Zone TV series. The film featured another segment that was directed by Joe Dante, so clearly this pairing of Spielberg and Dante is what led to them both working on Gremlins together. The idea of little monsters has been around in movies way before we reached the 1980s. But what Gremlins and its many imitators had going for it, besides the birth of video rental, is the injection of humour that made it a horror film for all the family. Who doesn't remember seeing Gremlins as a child? The film is credited as being the reason why PG-13 rating in America came into being, as many parents who took their children to see it in theatres complained about the level of violence in a film they had been led to believe only needed PG levels of parental guidance. But whether the film is too violent for children at this point is all a bit moot. Fact is, for many kids, this was the first time they got to sit down in a theatre with their families and watch a horror film. It's that nostalgia that keeps many people going back to Gremlins, despite its mismatched tone, gigantic leaps in logic, and its almost Benny Hill style levels of comedy. But the die had been cast, and the floodgates were now opened to a whole stream of movies featuring little monsters of one sort or another. Only 5 months after the release of Gremlins, we got Ghoulies, in which a band of little demons come to terrorise some white middle-class Americans in their suburban home. The film was produced by Charles Band, a man so obsessed with bringing little monsters to the screen that he would go on to make that other 80s classic, Troll. A film where, as the trailer proclaims, myths and legends come to life. It features a character who opened up to a world of magic, who may need a little magic himself if he's going to get out alive. The name of this character, you ask?
Harry Potter Jr. expected to have a little trouble getting adjusted in his new neighborhood.
With the rise of this subgenre throughout the 80s, even some of the biggest names in horror wanted to get in on the act, including none other than Stephen King himself. Cat's Eye featured 3 short stories written by King. The first 2 of these were adaptations of King's previous work, but the final story, The General, written specifically for the movie, features a little goblin that comes out of a hole in the wall to steal the breath of a little girl, played by Drew Barrymore. This casting is yet another link to Spielberg, as well as King's own Firestarter. It's not hard to imagine that this particular story was inspired by the tremendous success of Gremlins the previous year. In 1986, we saw the release of my own personal favourite movie from this subgenre. That film is Critters, and while many critics upon its release dismissed the film as a Gremlins knockoff, I believe it to be the much superior film, with a tighter pace and much more focused central narrative. It also has a better handle on internal logic, which I find to be missing quite often from Spielberg's movie. Now, I'm not saying the film is any more believable, because clearly when you are dealing with monstrous alien furballs and shape-shifting bounty hunters, you're clearly within the realm of science fiction. But the film does a better job of establishing the rules by which it intends to live by, making it easier for audiences to buy into its outlandish plot. As the 80s continued, we got The Gate, sequels to both Ghoulies and Critters, and also Munchies, a film that didn't even attempt to hide the fact that it was just a Gremlins ripoff. Charles Band would also rear his head once more as producer on the film Dolls, which he would essentially rip off just a couple of years later when he made his own Puppet Master, the first film to be produced by his Full Moon production company. Puppet Master itself would spawn 9 sequels, with even more on the way, becoming Full Moon's most successful franchise. More recent movies that fit into this subgenre are The Mist, Krampus and Slither, not to mention the Guillermo del Toro produced remake of Don't Be Afraid of the Dark. On the whole, modern day monster movies seem to have veered away from the tiny terrors we grew up with in the 80s, unless you count the sequels that are still being made to those films, such as the upcoming Cult of Chucky. But that balance of genuine scares mixed with the comedy that comes from putting a white middle-class family under attack from sinister little creatures seems to be few and far between. Suffice to say, there is definitely an audience out there for these movies. But whether Hollywood can come up with any original stories involving goblins, gremlins, demons or alien critters to terrorise some more suburban families, or simply resort to the inevitable remakes of some of these 80s classics, one thing's for sure: little monsters have definitely earned their place in horror movies.